Welcome, Bill Whittaker.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, well, at first I wore yellow for Iowa today. It's not Hawkeyes because it's not black, but at least the Hawkeye yellow.
Yeah. Oh, good, good, good.
And I think my sunrise or maybe it's the sunsets from Kansas. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
but
close enough.
so happy to have you on and thank you for taking the time. I was trying to
Yeah.
remember the year we met. It's at least 10 years.
Yeah, well before COVID. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so how was the book tour and the movie tour going?
Yeah, the book tour finished right before COVID started.
Yeah.
And then the movie, it's still playing. We're going over to Michigan in 2 weeks and playing over there to the Maritime Museum. They're interested in Native American history. So, and then we have a full curriculum that is with the 40-minute film. So, and that's playing all over Illinois in schools and nonprofits. We're playing out at the McGee House, which is west suburbs of Chicago here, and doing a curriculum day there for the Glen Ellen Public Library. So, people are just interested in the story. And what I'm really finding are people are interested in local history. And, it even gets more localized than that. So, where do I live? Who was here on my house and where I live? So, and of course, Billy Caldwell's been all over the country, but but I think that's when I dropped my son off at the University of Iowa many, many years ago. I went to the Iowa State Library, the one there in Iowa City, and just was talking to the librarian, asking her about the history. They were digging up the historical books. And she said, "Well, William Whittaker is here." And I'm like, "What? What? Tell me everything." And she gave me your name. I looked you right up right then. I called you that day, and you said, "Well, come on over." So I hiked on over. I remember it was so hot that that summer, but I came over and you showed me the book that you published.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I do remember that now. Yeah, that was a long, long time ago. Yeah. In fact, they're closing that library, as you may have heard.
No, I didn't hear.
Yeah, they've slashed the budget for it. They're going to move maybe 60% of the books to the 60% of the collection to the State Historical Society in Des Moines. And they're hoping that other departments will take the rest of the collection, but they don't really have any solid plans for any of it.
It's a beautiful building and a beautiful collection. And I haven't been to the one in Des Moines, but boy, it sure was nice for me to be able to just walk in there that day.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So
quite a
why don't you
shame.
explain your role at the University of Iowa?
Okay, I am a research director at the Office of the State Archaeologist, which is a research division within the university. We're not academic, and we do survey work for archaeology around the state of Iowa. We do public education and outreach regarding Iowa archaeology. We, you know, we curate artifacts from throughout the state. We record the archaeology sites that are within the state, and when we have time, we try to do our own research, and that's kind of what led me to my work on the the location and role of Native Americans in historic Iowa, meaning like from the 1700s to the current time. And so that led to a bigger project, which I think is how I met you, was called the Historic Indian Location Database, or the HILD, where you know we've been trying to go through all the historic accounts in the state of Iowa and pinpoint where Indians were noted by settlers or by historic documents or on maps, and try to figure out what tribes were at what location and at what time and what were they doing to really flesh out the historic occupation of Iowa by Native Americans. And we can use that to see sort of some of the gradual changes in uh, how Native Americans, you know, occupied Iowa. What was their territory? Where did they have conflict? Where were they leaving their territory to get other resources? And that kind of led to my interest in the Potawatomi, because in historic accounts of Iowa, there isn't a lot of information about the Potawatomi. They're kind of overlooked because they come fairly late in Iowa's history. Uh, there's no major conflict associated with them, so they're not written up like the Sauk or the Dakota are. So they're just kind of there, and it was interesting to sort of flesh out where how they wound up in Iowa, how they expanded throughout the state, what happened to them after their supposed removal, and just a just a whole chunk of history that I didn't know much about, and I don't think most Iowans know much about.
And that was the book that you showed me, if I remember right. It was had a red cover on it, and it was the western edge of Iowa, where in Council Bluffs, if people don't know the geography, along the Missouri River, and it was the Caldwell camp specifically, and you had kind of overlaid the current geography over it. And were you actually out there and visiting the sites?
Yeah, I've been out there several times to do archaeological research. I don't think any of those sites have been archaeologically excavated. Some of them are fairly well known, like where the location of uh, the block houses were. The, the, to back up a little bit, the map of the Council Bluffs area, which shows a lot of the Billy Caldwell sites, was actually done by a Belgian missionary named Pierre Jean de Smet, who arrived in 1838, I want to say, uh, to minister to the Potawatomi. And he was an amateur geographer and walked around and, to the best of his ability, he had pretty good ability actually, mapped the locations of villages and swamps and meanders and graves and all kinds of stuff up and down the Missouri River Valley. So it's just a spectacular map, which gives us a lot of information about where Indians were living at that time period. Um, he was also, he might have actually learned some of his geography from uh, Nicolay, who's famous for mapping uh, the northern Great Lakes, especially northern Minnesota, all those hundreds of little lakes. Nicolay is the first one to really map them.
In
And
Wisconsin too.
oh yeah, and he had um, Desmet, you know, keep logs of uh, keep barometer logs, because at the time and even now, one way to figure out your elevation is to take barometric readings. The higher in elevation you go, the lower the air pressure, but you have to take account for what changes in the weather. So you need barometers at stable locations, so you can see how the weather's going up and down. And Desmet took care of one of Nicolay's barometers and kept a good log for him, so that Nicolay was able to figure out the elevations of northern Minnesota and on his mapping tours. But that's kind of getting off topic. Desmet was uh, really he was a pretty good advocate for the Potawatomi. He was obviously had his own agenda as a missionary and trying to baptize as many people as he could. But he was also, working on their behalf to make sure that they got their annuities and promised uh, material from the U.S. government. He was often a uh, problem at the time because everything had to come up by steamboat up the Missouri from St. Louis, and the steamboat was very treacherous. And so his first summer there was a tragic sequence where the people were on the verge of starvation because had been a long winter and the river was frozen over. The one steamboat, the Pirate, got caught in a snag a few miles below the Potawatomi villages and sank with all of its supplies in it. And it took another month for or another steamboat to come up to actually come up with the supplies. In the meantime, renegade traders are trying to get uh, the the Indians of the area to trade furs for alcohol and well, primarily alcohol. And so that you have a bunch of starving people who are kind of desperate, who are now being fed huge amounts of alcohol. So it was a pretty nasty situation all around. And Desmet was there to really document it, and he also knew um, Billy Caldwell, and he recorded some of his observations and conversations with Caldwell. So it was a very interesting part of Iowa history that's not well known. Yeah.
When I love listening to you talk about this because when I met you and throughout the course of all the interviews we've done and the film clips that you're in the movie, you're such a um um well, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, such a resource in terms of accuracy and academic information. And as you're talking now, I'm kind of wondering, do you have that kind of detailed information for other areas of Iowa? Or was it because DeSmet left this map and this diary?
Well, it's really spotty. I mean, there's a lot of detailed information about the Sauk and Meskwaki in the
Mm.
Mississippi Valley because, well, primarily because of Black Hawk and his uprising. That kind of took a lot of uh, white America by surprise. They're like, where the hell did this come from? Suddenly
Yeah.
there's this Indian who's tearing across Illinois and cutting up into Wisconsin, and nobody was really paying attention to what actually led to that occurring. And so there's, beginning in 1831 to 1840 or so, there's a huge outpouring of information about the Sauk and Meskwaki and where they are and what they're doing and their history and where their villages are. So you'll have like this pulse of information about uh, the historic period of Native Americans. Another example would be when the U.S. military had military fortifications within Iowa, like at Fort Madison in the War of 1812. There's a lot of information because there's somebody sitting there writing it down and sending these dispatches from the fort, about how Indians are attacking. Or up at Fort Atkinson in the 1840s, which is in sort of northeast Iowa towards north central Iowa, where you have a large garrison and they're recording the comings and goings of tribes, especially the Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago, and their dealings with the Dakota and the conflicts that they have. So you have like little pulses of history that flare up as people are there to record it. You can get more of uh, the rest of the state that isn't as intensively recorded if you kind of really comb through newspapers and diaries and accounts where people spot Indians or they report legends of, oh, there was a battle here 5 years ago. I didn't see it, but I heard about it. Or my grandpa came to this area and he saw Indian burials up in scaffoldings or up in the trees. And you can slowly piece together the interior of Iowa where there isn't a lot of information about what tribes were where and what they were doing. So, I mean, yeah, so it's just like any history. It's really spotty and you just gotta ferret out what you can from what resources are there.
Well, thank you. That was just occurring to me as you were talking, because I haven't really asked you about the rest of the state. But
Yeah.
as you get toward the western side of the state, the Council Bluffs area, I don't think we've talked about this before, but why do you think Iowa? Why do you think Council Bluffs? And because at the same time, so many other tribes were being pushed west of the Mississippi River. And so we have the Mississippi River and we have the Missouri River. And the Mississippi is on the eastern edge of Iowa, the Missouri River is on the western edge of Iowa. But so many more tribes were moved west of the Missouri River. And yet Billy Caldwell moved up to Council Bluffs from Platte River.
Yeah, I don't think it was his choice. I think they were assigned that location by the Army and it has to do with the proximity of Fort what you call it on the other side of the river. So basically, they wanted tribes to be near uh, the name is escaping. It's on the Council Bluffs, which are actually in Nebraska. They wanted tribes to be near there where the military can be close to, and also there were established trading posts along the Missouri in that area.
Okay.
So that's and the the army didn't want to have any more trouble than it already had, so it tried to segregate Indians by tribes and didn't want to stick Indians who didn't get along into the same location or area. So they were always trying to figure out, well, where can we stick these people where they won't get in trouble, that kind of stuff. Um, and and it kind of worked. I mean, there's accounts of the Potawatomi fighting with the Dakota, who were their enemies. But then again, the Dakota didn't really get along with anybody at that time period, and so you know they were certainly on the list. Uh, the Yeah, so it's just kind of where they could be crammed at the time, and because they were there a number of years, they they established ties and roots to the land and were reluctant to leave when finally, they were able to open up proper reservations for them west of the Missouri and on down to Oklahoma. They just needed to park them for a while, and Iowa was the
Yeah.
location.
Well,
But
thank you for that. I know that I could not have finished this movie without you, Bill.
oh,
And
thank you.
I'm so grateful for your academic research and for just all the sheer knowledge and depth of research that you did, combining you with Mary Lou McGinn and Council Bluffs. Really,
Yeah.
I couldn't have finished the book or the film without you.
Well, I got your next project, which is I want you to look into Johnny Green. I think I've told you about him before. He was a Potawatomi who's almost in the late 19th century in Iowa was kind of like a Paul Bunyan. He would just sort of pop up everywhere, and everybody knew about him. Everybody saw him, and everybody had opinions, and everybody had stories about him. But you just can't pin him down. He's got 3 different burial locations. Most people say he's Potawatomi. Some people say he was Meskwaki. Maybe he was both. Some Meskwaki claim that some of the Meskwaki are descendant from Johnny Green because Green is a surname in among the Meskwaki. The but the sheer number of sightings of him, it can't be one human being. I mean, he can't be active from the War of 1812 to the 1890s, wandering around Iowa. So this is this some sort of generic name for a friendly Native American who's wandering around the state. And I think if people saw a Native American and had a good interaction with him, they just assumed it was this fabled Johnny Green. So
Johnny Green.
yeah.
Well, since you mentioned him, this whole 30 years has just been serendipity. My husband and I talk about it on the very first podcast. You know, since then, I've been working with the descendants of Archange and Antoine Wilmette. So Sharon Hoog Stratton and her cousin Cole Rattan. Sharon lives in Chicago and Cole's in Oklahoma. And Cole is a rampant researcher and unbelievable researcher. And so he's been sharing all kinds of family documents with me. And one of them is the tribal rules. And guess who's on the tribal roll?
One of the Johnny Greens.
Yeah, one of the Johnny Greens.
Yeah.
So, and then I met a couple that was from the northwest corner of Iowa. They were doing a totally different film on a creek, Trouble Creek, I think it was called up there. And they have some information about the Meskwaki and Johnny Green up there. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah,
um,
yeah.
oh, Bill, I think you've started
Yeah,
another obsession.
yeah, he even owned property, and we have he purchased property in Ringgold County um, from the federal government, and so he's actually on a deed as both his Indian name and as Johnny Green. Then I think he had abandoned it in a few years because taxes weren't paid or something like that. But there's something funny going on, and just following the trail might in of itself be a very interesting story. I don't think you're ever going to find the Johnny Green. You might find a bunch of Johnny Greens, but whether there was one Johnny Green is kind of doubtful. But yeah.
Well, you've created another rabbit hole for me. So getting back to Council Bluffs, because your expertise in this area is so important to the film. We had Father DeSmet come in. We have some notes from his diary of kind of the horrific conditions that were there. Can you just give the listener a little bit of an idea about Council Bluffs at that time? You have I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the Loess Hills, that geographical phenomenon that left over from the glaciers, and just kind of what Billy Caldwell and the other tribes might have faced living there 200 years ago.
Well, it would have been, I think, a bit of a shock for them because they had up until that point been living in fairly urban areas or close to urban areas. And now they're being transported to a very remote area where the only tribes around them are other transported tribes. The Loess Hills are very beautiful. You have the the Missouri Valley, the Missouri floodplain itself is flat as a pancake, and it goes on for 20, 30 miles. It's just huge, this huge flat expanse broken up by trees and sloughs and, and huge prairies. And then the Loess Hills on the east side of the bluffs, which make up the east side of the bluffs of the Missouri River Valley, are kind of these steep hills. Uh, at the time he showed up there would have been very few trees on them. Now they're all tree covered, but at that time they were pretty bare. Like all the early depictions of them just show like a stray tree or two, and so it would have looked very unlike Illinois or Indiana or the Great Lakes. Just like this really open landscape of prairie and these steep, uh, almost mountain, small miniature mountain-looking hills overlooking this extremely flat plain where you can see this really long, important river snaking along down through it. There were several trading posts already set up there. There had been trading posts since the probably the late 1700s, certainly by the uh, early 1800s, uh, uh, run by the descendants of French fur traders. There were a few families who were mixed, who were living in the region, mixed of uh, the French Canadian fur traders and local indigenous people. Who had cabins in the general area. Uh, there was a small blockhouse built just before the Potawatomi came in what would be now downtown Council Bluffs,
Mhm.
and uh, so Caldwell's villages were set up around that blockhouse and also up and down the floodplain of the area. They typically were close to established trading posts, or close to the river, or close to the main blockhouse. As time went on, they ventured farther into the interior of Iowa and into the Loess Hills. Or sort of like Wabansi, who was a later leader, had a large settlement in the interior up in the Loess Hills. Uh, he's actually one of the last recorded Native Americans buried within an Indian mound in the state of Iowa. The mound is since gone, but it was recorded that he was buried in a mound, which was pretty interesting to me because mounds are another interest of mine. Um, the they would have been reliant upon trade at the beginning, but as time passed on, they were able to, uh, do their own agriculture. They had implements imported. They knew how to farm to begin with, and they were able to break land and start doing their own farming. Uh, Wabansi and maybe Caldwell started a lumber mill, on one of the streams. They established several cemeteries that the exact locations are kind of sort of vaguely known. They, uh, you know, so that they're basically in limbo. They're getting settled into this area, and I think they're growing attached to it. And based upon how reluctant they were to leave it, they clearly were getting attached to it. But they also knew that at any time the U.S. Army could come and uproot them again. So it would have been sort of a liminal period for them. So.
And then in your research, it seems like cholera was really the deadly disease at that time, and that's what really got Billy Caldwell and I suspect the Wilmets around 1841.
Yeah, there was a famous incident. Was it the steamboat called the Dollar?
Mm.
I may maybe not be remembering correctly, but a steamboat came up and had illness had broken out on its trip up the river, and they were discharging people who were sick out of the boat. And I I don't remember all the details, but yeah, they would have had sick people being dropped off along the way, along the banks of the Missouri River, where there were settlements where hopefully people would take care of them, but also unfortunately they would incubate the disease and spread it throughout the region. So yeah, it yeah, not the best situation out there.
Oh, I didn't know that. I always wondered how they could get cholera because when I was talking with Mary Lou McGinn, there's so many freshwater springs in Council Bluffs. I mean, they
Yeah,
knew where the fresh water was, so I didn't
yeah,
understand how the cholera would have spread.
yeah. I'll look that up. I think it was called the Steamboat Dollar, and it was like
Mm.
late 1830s. Went up the Missouri and spread cholera. Let me see if I can find that.
What else did you discover? What kind of surprised you in your research when you were looking at that western edge of Iowa?
Um, well, it's always been an interesting area because it's really where like the tallgrass prairie of Iowa kind of blends into the what's going on in the Missouri River Valley and Nebraska. It's just a very different landscape. It's a different part of Iowa. The soils are different. You can't really farm it the way you can central Iowa. Um, the geography and topography are different. And prehistorically, you have very strange things going on. Hundreds of years before Europeans came, there were people who expanded out into the Loess Hills. For example, there's the there's a part of the Loess Hills near Glenwood, Iowa, where there's uh, uh, prehistoric settlements that look nothing like the rest of Iowa. These are earth lodges where people would have dug these large kind of oval or rectangular house basins with long ramps coming out of them that would have been covered by heavy timbers, and the soil would have been piled on top of the heavy timbers. And they're all clustered around the mouth of the Platte River, like the opposite where the Platte enters the Des Moines River Valley.
Yeah.
If you were to walk up any stream, you'd go about 10 kilometers. You'd sort of like do a sort of a cone shape, and all of these earth lodges are within that area. They're all within like sort of a long walking day of the mouth of the Platte River, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And it's called the Nebraska phase or the Glenwood phase of the Nebraska tradition. And the architecture is different. The artifacts are very different from what's going on in Iowa. It lasts a few centuries and then it disappears from that area. It continues in Nebraska and up into, you know, uh, farther west. But that was a sort of like one little pulse that came into Iowa. Um, Something
You
kind of
think
similar.
they came did those natives come from the South?
No, they came from the west.
From the
They,
West?
the older, um, the older Nebraska-faced settlements are within Nebraska, and it appears that they came down fairly early on, and this, for whatever reason, were trying to expand into the Missouri River Valley and up into the Loess Hills in the Nebraska, in the Glenwood region. But for whatever reason, after several generations, they just left, and they were replaced by the Oneota, which came from the east. The
Oh,
Oneota are like the ancestors of the Iowa, the Ho-Chunk, the Missouri, the uh, maybe the Kansas. The Whereas Nebraska became other Western tribes. I think like the Pawnee and other ones. I don't want to get in trouble and get my tribes
yeah.
wrong. I haven't
No,
looked
I
at it in
just
a
find
while.
it
Yeah, yeah,
fascinating. Thank
yeah.
you.
It's just a really neat area. Um, it's sort of like a different state once you get into the Loess Hills. You know.
After most of the tribes, you still have the Sac and the Fox in Iowa, but
Yeah.
most of the tribes left. What
Well,
were some?
I'm sorry, it was just the Meskwaki, which were the Fox. The Sauk
Oh,
pretty much left, and some married into the Meskwaki, but there also were a fair number of Potawatomi who also blended into the Meskwaki. You see a lot of accounts of Potawatomi and Meskwaki traveling together in Iowa after they were both supposed to have been removed, but they were,
yes,
yeah.
and friends of mine in the Prairie Band still travel with the Meskwaki. They do a lot of powwows together.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And
When,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just gonna say, so that uh, the the main settlement is called the the Iowa has no official reservations, but we do have something called the Meskwaki settlement, which is in Tama County, where the Meskwaki uh, were able to purchase their own lands and uh, start their own location that was eventually recognized by the federal government. Um, and because in 1846, the Sauk and the Meskwaki were supposed to have all been pushed out of the state forever and ever, but some of the Meskwaki who weren't getting along with the Sauks sort of remained hidden, and a lot of them came back to the state, uh, and they first were along the South Skunk River, then they switched to the Iowa River Valley and basically started their own settlement there, and they lived pretty clandestinely for the first few decades, but as the settlers came and realized that they were, harmless, they didn't want any conflict. They sort of, you know, became, relations were good enough, and the state government uh, wasn't having any trouble with the Indians, and so they just came to an agreement that the Meskwaki could stay there and they could purchase land and do their own thing, and that's where the Meskwaki settlement came. It's a very unique situation for natives, and
It is unique
yeah,
because
yeah.
I've talked to many friends in Illinois, and that's always been a question, why couldn't some tribes have stayed and, worked out a relationship, negotiated a relationship?
Well, I think it's because the the Meskwaki already had a reputation as being sort of the peaceful Indians,
Mm.
uh, whether it was earned, deserved or not, and settlers had positive experiences with them. They were in a part of the Iowa River Valley that nobody wanted to farm, so it wasn't like you know anybody wanted to steal their land from them. So that gave them refuge, and also at the time period, because the state settled pretty fast, especially that area by the 1850s, 1860s was uh, about as settled as it was going to be by European or by Americans. Um, that they were just sort of viewed as uh, uh, nothing non-threatening. And so it was fortunate for the Meskwaki that they were able to negotiate stuff in the 1850s, because by 1861 there was the Dakota Uprising, which put a huge fear of Indians in Iowans, and there was fortifications built in northwest Iowa. And so if they had waited a little bit longer, they would have encountered a very different situation and would not have been able to do it. So they were very lucky in their timing.
Yes, yes. When I think about the short time that the Potawatomis were there, 1837, 38 through 1845, they pretty much left for Kansas and Oklahoma by then. Um, but yet you have a county named Potawatomi County.
Well, yeah, yeah, that is the one where they were at, that because when the counties were named, they were still associated with it, and they're still there. And there are other, there are other places that are named for, like Wabansie State Park. There's a few that I'm not thinking of. And the Potawatomi never really left. I mean, some of them may have merged with the Meskwaki, but there was, uh, I believe, and I might get in trouble for saying this, but I think there was a separate Potawatomi burial area within the Meskwaki settlement, because they were so interconnected at the time, and so it's, you know, yeah, so they're there. They're part of our history. Yes.
What's left to discover in Iowa in relation with the Native American community there? What are some of your goals? What are some of the things that the university is interested in? Maybe the state of Iowa is interested in kind of capturing this ancient history.
Well, for historic Native Americans, my personal interest is actually, I've drifted to the 1970s.
Hmm.
I've looked at the American Indian movement, and until a couple of years ago, I had no idea that the AIM was so active in the state of Iowa, and that for example, they took over a federal building in Des Moines, with an armed incursion, and they took over the state education building, and it had to eventually, the governor of Iowa negotiated the surrender of the building back with the promise of amnesty for them.
Oh
Uh,
my.
and there was also a long-term uh, uh, occupation of lands that were historically occupied by the Omaha um, along the Missouri River, and that uh, led to conflict with the local police and landowners, and a protracted lawsuit that took, I don't know, over a decade. And eventually they were able to obtain land back in Iowa, and a lot of it was because uh, the, the Missouri River had shifted, and so land that was clearly part of the tribe was now within the state of Iowa, but nobody believed that there was any land in the state of Iowa that was occupied, that was belonged to the tribes. But the courts finally agreed that it was in fact their property. Um,
1970s, that wasn't too long ago.
no, no, and it was a very interesting, tumultuous time period. And so I haven't had a lot of time, but I'm just trying to sort of piece together who was where and uh, you know how they influenced each other and where they had meetings and it's just a real neat, totally forgotten aspect of Iowa history.
Totally forgotten. I'm trying to think about in relation to Chicago in the 1970s. I know after World War II, there was a movement to bring a lot of um, Native Americans to these urban centers for jobs and to get them off the
Hmm.
reservations. But I
Yeah,
don't know what was going on in the 70s.
yeah, it was that was the cultural awakening because you know I think that there had been uh, uh, such a strong attempt by the U.S. government to destroy Native American cultures, to destroy Native American languages through forced boarding school, that it, it was finally in the 1960s and 1970s that tribes had enough awareness and enough of them had gone through the system enough to realize what's going on, to realize the enormity of the situation, and were able to have the ways to communicate with each other, to organize themselves. And also, this is also in the milieu of the cultural revolutions of the United States, that began in the 1960s. Uh, and so things that would have normally the white society would never have cared about became flashpoints. For example, in Iowa, we had a one of the predecessors of her office excavated a cemetery that was in the way of a highway, and all the white people were reburied, but the natives were, put on the shelves for study. And not surprisingly, when Native people, including Maria Pearson, heard about this, they objected strenuously and said, "Well, this is racist," which it was, and you know, basically, got the governor to intervene. And by 1976, Iowa had the first law in the nation that protected Native graves as equal to uh, European or white people graves. Before that, it was perfectly legal just about anywhere in the United States to dig up an Indian mound and pull the bones out. You couldn't go to a white cemetery and do that, but you could legally dig up an Indian mound and do that. So, to its credit, Iowa was the first state to protect Native American burials, and also was the first state to establish a commission, uh, which is now since evolved into the OSA Indian Advisory Council, that archaeologists and natives would work together on issues of archaeology, like what do you do when you inadvertently find human remains? Who do you contact? Who reburies them? How is it studied? And all that comes from this time period where uh, Native Americans who had always were finally being cohesive and in communication with each other and had the ability to finally organize themselves on a national level. Um, this is the milieu where the AIM came from. This is where grave protection laws came from. This is where the end of the boarding schools began. It was a very tumultuous time, an extremely important time period in Native American history. And, I didn't know anything about it until quite recently. And so I'm eager to learn more about it and see where it goes.
Thank you. Thank you for all the research you're doing that. And I'm thinking about the cemetery that was behind the Black House. When I
Yeah,
talked with Mary Lou McGinn, she said she couldn't find the date where they took the top of that bluff off because
yeah.
they were going to build a hotel up there. So they moved a lot of the grave sites. Did you have a theory about where they moved them?
No, and then unfortunately that wasn't done archaeologically. It was done well before any research. There isn't a lot of documents that I've seen on it. So,
Yeah.
if you can find information, let us have it because we always try to keep track of that stuff and try to piece together what we can after the fact. So, yeah,
Well,
there's
when I looked at the Smets map, the Black House, which eventually was the Mission, when
mhm,
he had the little steeple on the top of it, he called it the St. Joseph Mission, which is
yeah,
the cemetery where Mary Lou's family is buried.
yeah, yeah. I'd have to go through what we have, but
Yeah.
as I recall, like the early, the it's not really clear exactly what happened where in the area. So, I mean, and I think a lot of that might be lost, as you said. They're just by development and by cutting away of the landscape.
Well, William, all the research you did, honest to gosh, I couldn't have done the film, I couldn't have done the book, I couldn't have had kind of that verification of some of this information without your research. So thank you so much.
Well, well, good. I really like the book. I think you did a great job with it. I love the film. I think you're doing good work with this, and I'm appreciated that I was able to help in any way possible. And keep it up, and we'll see what you do next.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.